Our speaker to get things rolling now is Dr. Peter Ant. He has had a long history of involvement in university, but now classifies himself as an organic olive grower from Mudgee, talking about key principles of an agri-ecological approach to farming. Please welcome Peter Ant.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. I'd like to acknowledge the elders past and present of the Wiradjuri people. I've enjoyed very much being involved in the regenerative agriculture movement for quite a few years now. I've had a bit of a checkered history from high school teaching to museum education to research manager at UNSW doing what was called the Future of Australia's Threatened Ecosystems under Mike Archer, which was all about commercial use of native species and conservation through use. And for the last 9 years I've been a lecturer in natural resource management and extension at the University of Sydney. I've only recently decided to part company from the University of Sydney for a whole bunch of reasons, one of which is wanting to spend time growing olives on our farm in Mudgee, which we bought a couple of years ago, and also to spend time doing the work that I really love. And I guess that's, if I had to put it in a few words, it would be working with innovative farmers. There's really inspiring people out there, many of whom are in the room today. And I've really enjoyed over the years as a university lecturer introducing students to the regenerative ag movement and also to the whole issue of how we actually support farmers and how we support innovation. I think we do it pretty badly. Unless there's a product to be sold, then we're very good at supporting innovation in this country, but if it's to change practices, we're not very good at supporting innovation at all. And I think that's something that is not going to come from government, it's going to have to come from us. So, you know, the regenerative ag movement, I think, is one of the most exciting things that's come out in my career. And I think we've got a great point of time here when pulling the movement together, looking for the things that unite us rather than worrying about the things that divide us, and really working hard for a unified approach to what we're going to do to pull the disaster around and make us work the way we know we can work with people doing it. So that's enough of me on my soapbox. I guess the other side to it is, in the last few years at the university, there's been a strong initiative on Indigenous knowledge. So with a colleague I founded an Indigenous land and food knowledge unit of study, and we were pushing ahead with work on grasses for grain, so looking at the grasses that were used by Indigenous people for food and understanding what the potential was for those grasses to become a bigger part of what we do on the landscape in general. So there's some of the things that I want to keep doing as an independent, having left the uni. Okay, so that brings us to this talk. One of the things that I did when I first joined the University of Sydney was I was involved in a project called Communities in Landscapes Project. Can I just have a show of hands of people who have heard of that, Communities in Landscapes Project? So it was funded under a previous government, Caring for Our Country grant, $4 million with a whole lot of partners. And we looked at what part of the philosophy was the communities are the ones that provide the continuity in the landscape, farmers and the support members within the communities, and how can we pull a whole range of agencies together to make that work for boxcar grassy woodlands. So through that, really, we spent a lot of time with the grazing eco-innovators as we came to talk about them. So that's what the bulk of my talk will be about. And then from that, I wanted to work out what are some of those key principles of an agroecological or a regenerative approach, and have a go with this audience as to how well they unite people in this audience that really want the same thing. And then also put in a plug for the Australian Institute of Ecological Ag, which is was formed many years ago under a different name. It's been renamed in the last 2 years as a cooperative. I'm involved in that with Kerry Cochrane and Johannes Bauer, and there's a number of other people involved in that. We're thinking that it could be the right vehicle to unify regenerative ag movement, and so we're keen to hear the views of people and see how we can actually get some sort of unity of purpose happening and a group coming together that unifies us. So that's what I'll spend some time on at the end. Okay, so the Communities in Landscapes project was a Caring for Our Country funded project with a whole lot of different partners. I was there as the University of Sydney representative, and I was one of the members of the steering committee to make that project happen. But essentially what we were looking for was strategies that integrate conservation and production in the box-gum grassy woodland environment. So we concentrated on 3 main areas. We did a participatory survey process in those centering around Wellington, Young and Wagga. We did what's called a participatory rural appraisal, where we interviewed lots of people on their properties to understand what were the issues they were facing in terms of conservation and production, and whether or not there were innovators out there that were integrating conservation and production. So we, rather than thinking of conservation as locking land up, we wanted to think of conservation as the broader scope of people taking up practices that improve the environment overall. And so was the bit that was missing out of the conservation from our perspective. And we were also looking for people who are interested in cross-property groups. So one of the challenges with conservation is getting coordinated activity amongst neighbouring farmers to get better connectivity, say along a riparian area, or connecting an area of native vegetation across farmland with other areas of native vegetation, which we all know is very important for biodiversity. So could we do that without locking land up and actually removing livestock, removing cropping? Is there a way of doing that in an integrated way with conservation and production happening together? So the outcome of these surveys was that it was very clear that there was a strong community of practice that was that were integrating conservation and production, that were regenerating native grasslands. They were doing it through some form of rotational self-grazing. They were using little or no fertiliser or herbicides. They were essentially a bottom-up innovation with a whole lot of advocates. And so Charlie Massey's book is a good example of a number of those people in that community, and Charlie, of course, is in that community as well. So there is that community. So one of the questions we wanted to answer through this Communities in Landscapes project was, is it working? So we did a 3-way thing. One was the participatory rural appraisal. The other was a micro-ethnographic study. So my colleague, Dr. Rebecca Cross, did her PhD on spending a lot of time with key innovators to understand why they made the change, what inspired them in that change, what sustained them in maintaining the change. And so she and I have been colleagues for many years, working on those sorts of things. And then a benchmarking study. And that benchmarking study was looking at 10 innovators through the 3 different areas. At the time it was catchment management authorities. So it was Central West, Lachlan and Murrumbidgee. 3 to 4 per catchment. They had to be identified by a number of other people in their area. And then we approached those innovators. We approached probably about 20 innovators, and we looked for innovators that had a comparison paddock with more conventional management across a fence line. And we did a whole lot of, we managed to find those 10 innovators and comparison landholders, and we did a detailed paddock history and description of management for the previous 10 years. We used a technique called landscape function analysis, and we did a vegetation survey on all locations, and on 4 of those locations we did a detailed soil chemistry, biology and physics analysis. So that's the sort of cross-boundary comparisons that we're talking about. This is the technique of landscape function. If anyone's interested in that, David Tonway, who was one of the key people who developed it, is still alive. I've been trained by David in managing and teaching people how to do landscape function, so I'm keen to help people who want to do that. And we did a whole lot of soil sampling and analysis. The landscape function, what it gives you is it gives you a measure of three key indicators: stability, soil stability, water infiltration, and nutrient cycling. And the bars you can see here, the orange bars are the innovators, and the red bars are the innovators, the orange bars are the comparison. And so just on the broad brush of those 10 innovators versus comparison, there were significant improvements in those landscape function. And so those are key things. Soil stability, it means that the surface of the soil is not prone to erosion or is prone to erosion on a scale. Water infiltration is to what extent does that surface encourage water to slow down, slows water down and makes it more possible for that water to soak in. And then nutrient cycling is the role of perennial plants in that system, and the amount of litter and then the degree of decomposition of the litter, which gives you a measure of how much natural nutrient cycling is happening. And our results suggested that across those 10 properties there was a 65% increase in natural nutrient cycling because of the change of management. So we did a whole lot of, I've got the soil data and everything, I'm not presenting them today because I think at a talk it's not worth doing, but essentially what we found was there was a significant increase in soil carbon, in soil phosphate, in nitrogen. There was an increase in pH, there was a decrease in bulk density in the innovators paddocks compared to the comparison paddocks. So these are all indicators of soil fertility. And so this flowchart is just to help us think through what the data was telling us from this benchmarking study. So the management data showed us that there was a change to rotational grazing management at least 5 years ago, led to greater stability, increased nutrient cycling, increased water infiltration, increased perennial plant and litter cover. The consequences of that was soil accumulation and increased soil moisture, and the soil data told us that there was higher soil phosphate, carbon, nitrogen and phosphorus and lower bulk density. And we also did microbial analysis which showed us that there was a greater diversity of microbes and there was a greater abundance of key components of that microdiversity. And the consequences of that was that soil was a better environment for plant growth. And what the management data then told us, that there was a landholder optimism and motivation was generated by this, that there was evidence of production and profitability, and that there was evidence of grassy woodland regeneration. And so our conclusion for that was that change in grazing management was actually achieving regeneration of elements of the box gum grassy woodland endangered ecological community. So here's an example of one of the innovators. This is water coming onto his property after a heavy rain. This is water leaving the property. So it's clearly operating as a very useful part of the landscape. Yes, 3 minutes. Okay, so I just want to run through this because I think the human motivation aspect of this is critically important. And this little flow diagram just is what I generated to try and understand what I thought was happening. People have alluded to the fact that they became a bit evangelical once they got involved in changed grazing management, and I think this helps to explain why that would be the case. So you can see there's a cycle where with human motivation and changing grazing management, you get a virtuous cycle where you get improvement in that landscape function. That improves animal performance, that increases biodiversity and increases tree regeneration, and these things have a feedback mechanism onto human motivation, and it becomes a positive feedback, increasing human motivation. And you can see that there's a whole bunch of other things that add on to the process as it goes further. So as people get further and further in and are successful in the grazing management, it has strong, positive, remotivating factors that happen, which probably also leaves the neighbours behind, which might be part of the problem that people have been talking about. So there are a bunch of conclusions. More water, more fertile soil, enhanced soil biology, more plant growth, healthy stock, and very importantly, less risk. So being able to forecast how much feed is ahead allows you to adjust your stocking rates to make sure you've always got 3, 6, 9 months of feed ahead of you, so you never get to the position where you are getting rid of stock in a hurry or you're feeding them. So if so good, why aren't more people doing it? Rebecca and I have spent a lot of time on this, and I think that it has to become more normal for the next wave of people to do it. They'll be motivated by different things. Rebecca's research suggested that there was a crisis, an epiphany that happened to make people change. Maybe the next wave will be people who see that there are positive pragmatic advantages of this, and it's not an ideological thing, but it's actually a pragmatic thing. I don't know, but I think that might be where we need to head. So I'm just going to skip on to what we think is the agroecological approach. I've got to finish. Okay. All right, so there's a few things there that I think are key agroecological approaches, and I'm really interested in, I'll just skip to the final one, the Institute of Ecological Ag. So we're working towards the principles, key principles of ecological ag. We're working on providing an umbrella organisation that might bring groups together. We want to provide professional development for eco-ag practitioners and also training and accreditation for educators. We're interested in working in partnership with organisations that are already out there doing some of those things. But to get some thing together, that's the unified approach. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Peter, and certainly a challenge to get all this content into 20 minutes. Two quick questions. Do bureaucrats respond better to science or case studies?
Wow. I think stories are really important. I think individuals who are actually doing something is very important. But if you talk about bureaucrats, if you call a government agronomist a bureaucrat, then it's got to be science. But I think therein lies the key problem. Agronomists are trained to do trials where they control all but one variable and do it over a period of time without any adaptation, whereas the innovation we're talking about is an adaptive innovation. And so people are adjusting their stocking rates, they're adjusting their rate of rotation, they're adjusting all of those things constantly depending on how the environment is going. And for that, an agronomic research approach doesn't work. And so what we need is an ecological approach to the research of these systems. And so we need to be working with practitioners to measure aspects of their system, to characterise them, to understand them in a scientific way as well as in a pragmatic way.
Okay. Another quick question. How important is it to educate the consumers of our produce?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, the fact that organic is only 1% of total retail sale, I understand. So it's orders of magnitude too small on a commercial scale, but its influence is far greater than that. It makes people think. I don't necessarily agree with all aspects of organic certification, even though I am certified organic, our farm is. But I think it's leading the way, and yet what we need, I think, is a more moderate but still rigorous form of accreditation that takes into account the regenerative approach, because organic is not necessarily regenerative.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter.